When you clock into work or take a weekend off, you might not think about how those rights came to exist. The 40-hour work week, the lunch break, workplace safety, all of these were once unthinkable. They weren't handed out freely, they were fought for with strikes, protests, and sometimes even blood. This is the story of how working people in America, often forgotten in textbooks, risked everything to claim basic dignity on the job. This is the lost history of labor rights in the United States. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, America was booming with industrial growth. Railroads crisscrossed the country, factories hummed day and night, and steel built the skyline. But while the economy soared, the workers behind it were suffering. Factory floors were dangerous, wages were low, and there were no benefits to speak of. Children, as young as 8, worked in coal mines and textile mills. Injuries were common. Deaths were routine. Families worked 12 to 16 hours a day and still lived in poverty. These weren't isolated conditions, they were the norm. At the time, there were no federal protections for workers. If you were injured or killed, your employer owed you nothing. And if you dared to speak up, you'd be fired off and blacklisted so no one else would hire you again. The powerful industrialists Carnegie, Rockefeller, Pullman built empires on the backs of this labor, while the workers who made it possible lived and died in obscurity. But out of this injustice, something began to stir: resistance. By the late 1800s, workers across industries were beginning to organize. Labor unions, like the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor, started forming in cities across the country. These were radical ideas at the time that workers could join together to demand better treatment. Strikes erupted, from rail yards to coal mines, and with each protest, the movement grew stronger. Yet the response was brutal. Strikers were beaten, arrested, even killed. Business owners hired private militias. Police and even federal troops were called in to suppress unrest. One of the most infamous events in this early labor struggle was the Haymarket Affair in 1886. Workers in Chicago were rallying for the 8-hour workday when a bomb exploded during a demonstration. The police opened fire. Chaos followed. Though the bomber was never identified, 8 labor organizers were arrested, 4 were executed. They became martyrs for the cause of labor and a grim reminder of how high the stakes truly were. Despite the bloodshed, the movement marched on. In 1911, tragedy struck again, this time in New York City. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire became one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history. The factory doors had been locked from the outside to prevent workers from leaving early. When a fire broke out, 146 young women, most of them immigrants, were trapped. They burned or jumped to their deaths as the city watched in horror. That moment shocked the nation and forced lawmakers to confront the cruel realities of factory labor. It became a catalyst for labor reform and workplace safety laws. Women weren't just victims of this era, they were leaders. In 1909, 20,000 garment workers, most of them women, staged the largest strike by women workers in U.S. history. They faced beatings, jail time, and freezing cold temperatures. But their courage forced factory owners to negotiate better wages and conditions. These women, often left out of history books, helped shape the labor movement's legacy. Children, too, were central to this story. Until the 1930s, child labor was widespread and completely legal. Kids worked on to dusk in dangerous conditions, without education or rest. Reformers like Louis Hina used photography to expose the horror. Finally, in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act outlawed most forms of child labor and introduced the 40-hour workweek and minimum wage. During the Great Depression, millions were unemployed and desperate. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal responded with sweeping reforms. One of the most critical was the Wagner Act of 1935, which guaranteed workers the right to unionize and bargain collectively. This was a turning point. The government was now siding with labor, not just capital. The 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act followed, setting a federal minimum wage. restricting child labor, and mandating overtime pay. Unions flourished in the mid-20th century. In the post-World War II era, union membership peaked. 1 in 3 American workers was part of a union. Wages rose, benefits improved, the middle class expanded. For the first time in U.S. history, regular working families had financial security, health care, and a path to retirement. Labor had power and it showed, but that power sparked backlash. In 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act was passed, weakening the rights of unions and giving employers more control. Over the following decades, corporate lobbying and anti-union messaging grew. The Cold War further damaged labor movements, painting unions as hotbeds of communism, and as globalization accelerated in the 1970s and 80s, factories began shutting down across the Rust Belt. Jobs moved overseas. Automation replaced human labor. Union strongholds collapsed. By the early 2000s, the American labor movement was in steep decline. Gig work became the new normal: no health benefits, no job security, no union protection. And yet, the legacy of the labor movement lives on. Every workplace protection we now consider: basic paid time off, sick leave, safety regulations, and weekends, was won by people who had to fight for it. Today, we're seeing flickers of a new labor awakening. Workers at companies like Amazon and Starbucks are organizing. Warehouse workers, delivery drivers, and even tech employees are forming unions. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed how vulnerable American workers still are and how crucial their labor is to keep society running. The history of labor rights in America is not a finished story, it's a struggle still unfolding. And remembering the past is essential to understanding the present, because rights that were once won can be lost, and justice, once secured, must be defended again and again. The labor movement wasn't just about wages, it was about human dignity. And for all the silence around it today, its echoes are in every shift worked, every paycheck earned, and every voice raised in solidarity.